Hello everybody, today on the channel it's big news. No, not the fact that I've had a haircut. This is even bigger and, believe it or not, more overdue. I am sure that regardless of whether you're into your German cars or not, you won't have failed to notice that over the last 7 or 8 years, the Porsche marketplace has gone absolutely bananas, with almost unthinkable prices being paid for the most humdrum of cars. And when it comes to something special, well, apparently the sky was the limit. Now, for some, this has been the absolute best of times, for others, the worst of times. But here and now, I think it is safe to say that it's over. So, in this video, I'm going to be talking about what exactly happened, how it began, why it has ended, and what's next. So, sit back, relax, crack open a can of water, and enjoy today's episode of JAYEMM on Cars. Wind the clock back around 12 or 15 years ago, and the Porsche buying experience was a very different one. The range had been expanding for about a decade or so, first with the introduction of the Boxster, providing a new entry point into the lineup, replacing the old transaxle cars like the 944 and finally the 968. Most significantly though, in the early 2000s, we had the arrival of the Cayenne, a genre-defining car and one that it could be argued kick-started the SUV craze that apparently we are unlikely to ever see the end of. Then, a little bit later, we had the Cayman joining the Boxster as the new entry point coupe, and of course the Panamera arrived too, which even today I'm kind of shocked Porsche actually ever made, because already in the mid-2000s that wasn't the sort of car that everybody was rushing out to buy. And though I actually consider the Panamera to be perhaps the most disappointing of all Porsches that I've driven lately, I am still eternally grateful that they even tried, because I think many other companies simply wouldn't have. But in spite of this expansion of the range and of the company's incredible growth, there was still one model at the heart of it all. That is the 911. And the simple fact was that the 911 was a brilliant car. Not just to drive, but also to own. It was particularly remarkable for the fact that despite it being a sports car, financially it actually made quite a bit of sense. Not only were they mostly reliable, yes I know, 996 and 997 generation cars had a lot of issues, but when they were new, they had warranties. But we're going to overlook that. The more important thing for a lot of people was the fact they were also relatively depreciation proof. You have to remember that back then, if you were to buy yourself a new Ferrari, say a 360, an F430, and heaven forbid a 612, it was a virtual certainty you were going to kiss goodbye to a lot of cash. In fact, most of the people I knew back then that bought a Ferrari generally agreed that in the first year you could lose up to £40,000 or £50,000, a significant percentage of the value of the car. The 911, meanwhile, was probably one of the best vehicles out there for retaining value, and when you combine that with its all-season usability, semi-practical rear seating and half-usable boot, it was a fan favourite. And the almost endless number of 911 variants meant there was a car for everybody, from the likes of the entry-level C2 Coupe, cited by many a magazine as actually the best, to the slightly more powerful and impressive Carrera 2 and Carrera 4S, then of course the Targa or Cabriolet, if you want that wind in the hair feeling, the continent-crushing Turbo, and the legendary GT3. But back then, those models, the spicy ones in particular, didn't have quite the same appeal as they do now. Yes, petrol heads loved them. Yes, they were seen on plenty of track days. But if you wanted a 996 or 997 GT3, all you had to do was walk into your dealer and tell them that you wanted one. Provided there was supply, which most often there was, you could have one. I knew of 997 GT3 RS that were in dealers who had to discount them before they could actually find a buyer. Such was the nature of things at the time. And I recall very clearly one magazine, I think it was Evo, saying if you weren't getting £10,000 at least off your new 911, you just weren't getting a good deal. Go somewhere else to get it. This is just how things were. We all knew, and I think it's still true now, that the 911 has one of the most generous margins in the business. Some car makers only get something like 50 quid of profit when they flog you a car. Porsche were making more like 40%. That's a crazy number for a car, and it's why they've kind of allowed it to develop as it is without trying to make it too like anything else. I know we got a little bit upset when the Boxster and Cayman appeared and were using a lot of 911 bits, but the simple fact was these changes were necessary in order for Porsche to survive. And as soon as the Cayenne landed, well, the company had just about enough money to do whatever it was that they wanted. Certainly enough to keep the 911 going. And if you don't believe me just how poor value for money the 911 is, compare it with the price of a Cayenne. And you'll see that though that's an awful lot more car, they were actually generally quite a bit cheaper. Regardless, this is how things were, and one of the best things about a 911 was, if you were thinking of buying a Ferrari, a 911, say a turbo, generally made quite a bit more sense. The performance was similar, if not better, and usually at a lower price. You had a better availability of dealers, they were going to be easier to own, the theory was they were going to be more reliable, you weren't going to lose quite so much money, and you didn't have to play any silly games with your dealer. But over the course of the 2010s, a few big things happened to change all of this. First off, we had Dieselgate, and this was really quite significant. I'm sure you've heard of it, and so hopefully it doesn't really require much explanation. In theory, Porsche should have been one of the companies that could sort of get away with it the easiest because, relatively speaking, diesel cars made up a fairly small proportion of their sales. So, other than the fact they simply just stopped selling them, didn't seem like it did the company all that much harm, despite the fact they were essentially a subsidiary of VW, who definitely didn't get away with it. The problem, though, was exactly that. As a subsidiary of VW, they were connected to this great big mess. And the simple fact was, VW had a massive fine to pay. And quite a few things had to go in order to raise the capital. First off, you saw the company withdraw from a number of its racing efforts, and I think this hit Audi the hardest, because they've been doing rather well at Le Mans, but unfortunately, it's quite an expensive thing to do, and it was deemed not really to be particularly financially sensible. They'd won it for a load of years, so what was the point? They'd done it, and so they didn't need to do it again. Porsche also had to sort of scale down a few of their efforts, but again, in not quite so big a way. The greater impact for Porsche, though, seemed to be for their road cars, where it would appear that discounts were effectively banned. I remember talking to a lot of people, both buying and selling these cars, who said that a few months earlier, yeah, you could have got 10 or 15 grand off a car, or at least something, and then all of a sudden, nothing. You want a new 911? There's the list price, that's what you're going to pay. If you don't want it, tough. As far as I could see it, what was happening here was that Porsche was being used as a cash cow. Because everybody knew it was a massively profitable arm of the business, they were told, great, make even more money, no more discounts. And what I also noticed at this time was that not only did discount vanish from your Porsche dealer, so did the notion of goodwill. Previously, if you'd had an issue with your car and maybe it technically wasn't the dealer's responsibility, or maybe a car had gone wrong a week after the warranty expired, they would often try and help you. They were a fairly amicable bunch. Like any manufacturers, they had some dealers that were better than others, but across the board, Porsche dealers generally seemed to be quite helpful. The people I know that worked at Porsche were very happy because, though technically speaking the salesman's salary wasn't that high, they got a very good bonus, so if they sold cars through the year, they were on decent money. That changed, I can tell you that for sure, but also so did the goodwill element. I know loads of people that had issues with their cars that were real cut and dry cases. Very, very simple, clear, this car is not right, it should go back, and nobody thinks otherwise, apart from the Porsche dealer. I have seen cases where the ombudsman has told the dealer they are wrong, they should take a car back, and they've still refused. They became incredibly difficult to work with. VW Finance in particular became awful, absolutely atrocious. If you had a problem, they went from being one of the best to deal with to one of the absolute worst. That's a shame, a real shame. Then, around this sort of time, so mid-2010s or so, we also saw the arrival of the Cayman GT4. By this stage, a lot of Porsche products had already gone up in price by quite a bit, particularly if you're talking about the old air-cooled stuff. However, when the GT4 landed, this was a whole new breed of car. Historically, we'd never really thought they would make something like that. You had the GT3, but that was a certain amount of money, and by this point in time, GT3s were becoming difficult to get, but not impossible. You'd have to wait, but you'd likely get one. However, then the GT4 came out, and everybody wanted one. In fact, so many people wanted one, and the car was offered at technically such an appealing price, there just weren't enough to go around. And so, whether the GT4 actually started it or not, I'm not sure. This was the first car where I really noticed the fact people were willing to pay overs now for a brand new car. I've always had a sort of on-off relationship when it comes to paying more for a car than its original list price. But when it comes to proper classic stuff, you know, a 2.7 RS or so, you can kind of be at peace with it because there's a reason people are asking big money for this car. You may agree with it, you may disagree with it, but generally speaking, the idea is it's gained a reputation over a certain number of years, it has now become rare, there will never be any more like it, and so you know kind of what you're buying into. When it comes to new cars though, well, if you're buying something on the basis there won't ever be another one like it, it's a very risky thing because you simply don't know until there is another one like it or not. You're just not sure. However, the Cayman GT4 came out and very quickly people started asking big money for them. I think the list price with options was just shy of £100,000 and quickly people were asking 110, 120, 125, 130, 140, 150. Then people started doing the same thing with other models and it went nuts. Anything that was hard to get hold of, interesting, spicy. So GT4, GT3, GT3 RS, they started going crazy. 996s, 997s. A few years earlier, they'd been, well, for 996s, 35 grand. They shot up to 60, 65, 70. 997s, well, they were depreciating. They stopped and did a quick reverse. Now a 997 GT3 was suddenly 100 grand again. This was crazy. They were nearly the same money as a 991 GT3, which incidentally is a great example of exactly what I'm talking about. The 991 GT3, PDK only. So I think people bought into the old 997 because, well, that's going to be the last manual GT3, isn't it? Only Porsche went and built the 911R, which I remember some people trying to sell for, I think, £1 million. That didn't go so well. I wonder what they're worth now. Let's take a look. We've got Auto Trader open up here and we're going to have a look through it. It's going to be a useful guide for the rest of this video. Is there an after sale? Yes, there are 3, and they're now £400,000 to £450,000. So still quite some way above their list price, but also quite some way down on their peak prices. In any case, the second generation 991 GT3 then reintroduced the manual as an option. All of a sudden, if you'd bought a 997 GT3 hoping it was going to be the last manual, you'd have felt like a little bit of a wally. In any case, things then carried on very much like this, or people paying overs and in some cases daft amounts for these cars. It seemed like it was going to continue just about forevermore. Around this time, finance was also becoming fairly affordable. And what you had was a fairly simple sequence of events, really. You have your car, let's just call it a £100,000 car, and if you're able to get a hold of a new one, you know that as soon as you've got it, it's worth, let's just say, £150,000, so 50% more than you've paid. This means that if you're going to buy the car on finance, which most people do, regardless of whether they could have actually bought it cash or not, it doesn't actually matter how good your finance is or not, and finance at the time was relatively cheap. So when you're looking at a car that's going to effectively make you a guaranteed 50 grand, the finance price doesn't really matter. You can afford that car because it's a profit. And because this for a long time was true, the cars were making money, it made the finance even more affordable because the finance companies were aware of this. They knew that these weren't essentially any more depreciating assets, instead they were appreciating ones. So if you went to a finance company and said, I've got an allocation for a GT3, they're almost certainly going to say yes because they knew they were safe. This meant that people who historically maybe wouldn't have been able to afford a GT3 now realised that they could. Because in the real world, if you bought a Carrera 2S at, let's call it 75 grand, and after 2 years it was worth 55 grand, so you've lost 20 grand, or a GT3 at 120 grand, and then it's worth 140 grand, well, actually, over that time, the GT3, the more expensive car, has made you money, and the other one has lost you. There's a £40,000 difference there. And what this means is, well, everybody wanted a GT3. This in turn meant that demand was now massively outstripping supply. And so, of course, the cars available on the market, well, their prices carried on going up. So people thought they were an even better thing to buy, and so more people wanted them. And so it kept going. Naturally, every car has its limit. When GT4s got to 150 grand, people just went, no. 911Rs at £1 million, I think that was always optimistic. But still, a lot of people were making quite a bit of money. How these allocations were made is a subject for an entirely different video that I have already done on a number of occasions. Suffice it to say, I didn't really like how things were done because it was the dealer deciding who got the cars. And let's face it, they didn't really put all that much effort into making sure the right people got them, did they? Then 2020 rolled around and everybody thought this situation was going to come to a grinding halt because COVID arrived and dealers had to shut. In sales terms, they were effectively stuck. More than that, a lot of finance companies thought, actually, no, the car market is going to be worth absolutely nothing. I remember around this time, I was trying to get car finance for the first ever time for my Ferrari 550. And a lot of finance companies I phoned up would say, hello, finance house, we're closed. They weren't doing deals. It didn't matter if you're a millionaire or a billionaire. They weren't taking any new business. Full stop. The car dealers were panicking, understandably, because they had stock they were kind of struggling to shift. Prices were high, and people were getting understandably nervous. They weren't sure if their car was going to be worth anything. They'd bought something that they knew they'd paid massive overs for, and they thought, oh crumbs, the market is going to collapse, the car's going to be worth absolutely nothing. I was told this as a fact by a whole bunch of people, and I know a lot of guys that sold cars at a loss just to get out because they thought, you know what, if I sell it today, the loss is going to be this big, but if I wait 6 months, the loss is going to be this big. People were panicked. Some great deals were had during this time, but the dealers had made a big mistake. Big, huge. They shifted all their cars. They sold them at rock bottom prices because they were panicking the market was collapsing. It wasn't. Then 2021 came around and they realised they'd sold all their cars. Because the factories had been shut for so long, there was now a massive delay in getting anything new. And so, customer walks through your door, wants a car, the only place you can get it is by buying it from somebody that's already got one. So this is when the price of used cars began to climb because as supply was effectively a year behind and they'd sold off all their stocks for cheap, they were then struggling to get cars. So people were being called by their dealers, and this was not just Porsche specific, this was everyone, and they were being told that, oh yeah, you know that Golf that we sold you last year for 30 grand, can we give you 32 for it? People were delighted. They were amazed. They thought, great, I've had a free car. They kind of overlooked the bit where they then had to replace said car, and though they'd made 2 grand on theirs, the one they wanted to replace it with was sort of 5 or 10 grand more, and it didn't actually work out all that well. Finance houses also realised that because they hadn't really done much business for 2020, they also needed to make their targets. So for a lot of 2021, it felt like you would phone them up and they'd say, hello, finance house, if you want it, you can have it. I know people that went out there looking at 100 grand cars and their finance application was being approved like that. And 6 or 7 months earlier, it would have been a process of, we need to look at this, we need to look at this, we need to check this, we need to check this, print out these statements, prove this. That all went out the window. They want your business, they'll have it. 2022 also saw a couple of major global events have a massive impact. First off, the war in Ukraine, which in Porsche terms created an issue because, as is the case with many manufacturers, they sourced their wiring harnesses from there, and supply naturally became something of an issue. Granted, actually a completely insignificant one compared with everything else that was going on. But, as the topic of today is the Porsche market, that was a big problem. The other was the global semiconductor shortage. There was a fire in a factory, one of the few in the world that builds these things, and, as a result, a whole number of things had an issue with supply, not just cars. This was very good news for those who'd been riding this Porsche gravy train because it meant the supply of new cars continued to be restricted. Used ones were still the only way to get a hold of a lot of stuff. But I then began to notice something, and you tell me if I'm crazy or not. It felt like for the majority of 2022 and 2023, almost everybody that I saw online or in person collecting a new Porsche was getting one of the special ones. It was a GT4, GT4 RS, GT3, GT3 RS. And I developed a theory that what Porsche were doing was they knew they couldn't make cars in the same quantity as they always had. So what you do then is make fewer cars, but the ones with the biggest profit margin, which is going to be the GT cars. They also were, of course, doing great business in the secondary market because they were making overs. Excellent news for Porsche dealers. They can make money on the same car 2 or 3 times, often in suspiciously rapid succession. What is my evidence for this? Well, allow me to show you. Here we are on the Auto Trader UK website, and you can filter it by a number of different ways, most handily by model variant. So, currently today, there are just over 7,000 Porsches for sale, of which 2,408 are the 911. Now, these will stretch back over a number of different years, but helpfully, Auto Trader has subdivided them into generation. Let's skip down to the current one, the 992. And you will see that for the 992 Carrera, there's 38 cars for sale. And I would say these 4 here, so the 2 and 4 wheel drive variants of the S and the GTS, they're the mainstay of the lineup. They're the volume cars, right? Well, there are 50 GT3s up for sale. Bear in mind, that's a car that's been in production for a shorter space of time. There are also about 30 GT3 Tourings. So combined, there are 80 992 GT3s for sale, meaning it would be, well, about the 5th most common of 992 variants for sale on Auto Trader. That's the rare car. That's the one that nobody can get a hold of. Bear that in mind. In fact, the only one that has more than any of these for sale is the Turbo S. This is a car that people were paying massive overs for, even a year and a bit ago. In fact, you could say the same for most of these cars. I recall a friend of mine wanting to buy a 991 GT3. He'd previously had one and kind of missed it, so he looked at buying one. And 2 years after he sold that car, he found that he would actually have to pay more to get one like it back, which just seemed daft. This was in 2022 when all these things I was talking about were going on. And in fact, it's the 991 GT3 that prompted me to make this video, because if we go and look at these, you'll notice, whereas about 18 months ago I couldn't have found one of these for less than 100 grand, now they're up for 89, 850, I'm sure I saw one for 79,995 in fact. But I've just installed something new on my computer. It's the Auto Trader Price Tracker. It's an extension for Chrome, and it does exactly what it says on the tin. It shows you not just the current price of a car for sale, but also the previous prices it's been up for. So let's now look at the 991 GT3 list with that enabled. And you'll see here the cheapest currently is 89,850, but you'll see the next cheapest, 89,995 at Bespoke, and that was 99,995 in May. They've dropped it quite a bit since then. Here's another, 91,795, been up since August. That was up at 95 grand. Here's another, that was up in July at 97 grand essentially, and they've knocked about 5 grand off. This is a Porsche approved. Then we've got one here, it's about 3 grand off, and it's been up since September. Another one here, it's been up since July. This one's a new one. Here, another car, £10,000 off at Premier GT, still hasn't sold. Been there since July. Here's one, been there since June. They've only knocked £5,000 off of it, and I'm surprised that they don't realise that's why it's not sold. Here's another car. This was listed in June at £109,900, now up for £96,500 at Porsche Centre, Perth. See what I'm getting at here? In fact, do you want to know the worst? It's actually not even the 911. It's the Cayman, the GT4 RS, and I knew this was going to happen. These have been dropping like crazy, partly because I think a lot of the people that bought them explicitly to make money, and the market has gone, no thank you very much. The cheapest currently is 159,995, looks like a nice example, and it's got some mileage on it, 15,000. The next cheapest is 170,000, but then we start to get into the cars that have sat around for a while. Look at this one here, 174,500, but it's been up for sale for only, well, not even a month, and they've already dropped it by £21,000. Yeah. This one here, nice blue, 174,990. It's been up since September, and it was at 189,900. Another one here, they dropped over £10,000 off of it in the month and a half. It's been up for sale. This one, oh, this takes the biscuit, was up in June for £212,990. Now, 177,790. That's pretty extreme, isn't it? This one here is up for 178, was 194 in August. Same thing here, 181, was 194, also in August. Haha, this is nuts. I bumped into a thread earlier where a guy is trying to sell his 911 Turbo S for list price, and quite a few people have pointed out the fact that dealers are actually knocking money off. The Turbo S, in fact, I find is the most fascinating of all. I don't understand how it became a car people were paying overs for, like the Heritage design, the horrible Targa thing, this thing. That should never have been over list. That £210,000, you're nuts. You buy that. Look at that, 150 grand for essentially the same car. It's got 39 miles on it. Yeah, it's going to sit on 39 miles for quite some time, I think. But the Turbo S is fascinating. First off, there are basically no normal turbos. I mean, there's 30 of them versus 171 of the Turbo S. Okay, the cheapest Turbo S for sale is at Glenfield of Kilmarnock, which is probably not somewhere most people are going to buy a 911 Turbo S from. But it's a 2020 car with less than 10,000 miles, and it's up for £139,995. And they've had it since August. This is the cheapest Turbo S in the country on Auto Trader. They've had it since August, and they've knocked nearly £20,000 off of it in that time. Still can't shift it. This one, same again. Been there since August. They've knocked a little bit less, but £8,000 off. Look at this. This is nuts. These are all new listings. These are new listings. Here's another one. Was up in July at £169,000. Now £147,500. £22,000 they've knocked off that car since July. Another one here, a little bit less discount, a little bit less discount. But if you want to know the most telling examples, let me show you those. You find those by going price highest. Not these, they're nuts. Okay, here we go, look. Look at this. This is a brand spanking new car at the dealer. Brand new at the dealer, being discounted. Look at this. Save over £10,000 on a new turbo. Save £14,000 on a new turbo. Save £11,000 on a new turbo. Save £6,000 on a new Turbo S. They were not doing a penny off these a little while ago. You had to pay masses over list. Now, I've known this is coming for quite a while. I've spoken to people in finance in particular, and they've been trying to talk people out of buying Turbo S's because, you know what? The Turbo has never had the allure that the GT3 did, but demand was so great on the GT3, dealers were convincing people this was essentially as good as. This was basically just as solid a bet as a GT3. And for a little while, for a really, really short while, it was true. In fact, in 2021, the GT4 was the first car that I remember hearing, the 718 GT4. People were getting calls saying, would they like a GT4 and would they like some money off? Because they were struggling to find buyers for them. They didn't want to advertise that they had these cars, because the minute you do that, the minute you let people know you can just have one, the whole thing collapses. And they worked really, really hard to try and hide that from people. But now, no. I mean, look, you're not going to be able to walk into your local Porsche dealer and get a brand new GT3. Certainly not RS. It's just not going to happen. They are still genuinely limited. But let's look at, say, the RS market. Okay, so what are the overs being asked on these? That's disgusting. That's absolutely disgusting. I mean, they're all discounting them already. But to be honest, £400,000 for an RS? No. madness. Absolute madness. I'd rather have an R. The Dakar, this has arrived. This is another thing that hasn't helped, okay, is that whereas before you had the GT3, GT3 RS, well now you've got GT3, GT3 RS, you've got another version of the Sport Classic, you've got the Dakar, you've now got the ST as well. So the collectors, the people that have got masses and masses of money, they've got more cars to kind of put it into. And for everybody else, it's kind of split things. Now, I kind of love this about Porsche. Preuninger has never really cared about kind of, you know, saving anyone's bank balance. He's never really cared about, you know, ensuring the viability of something as you know, as a financial thing. He doesn't like the idea of his cars as hedge funds, but it's muddied the water of the market for sure. Let's have a look at the Tourings. Okay, so again here, they're still commanding big money. So let's look at the cheaper ones. Okay, so okay, so here we go. 184,995 was 197. So that's lost quite a bit of money since August. You notice also the cars are up there for quite a while. So again, another one here, that's had about 15 grand knocked off of it. Another one here, that was up at 217 in September, and now it's already 198. Another one here, this was 235 at Aberdeen for a car with 589 miles on it. I guarantee you that 589 miles, the person bought this either hoping to make loads and loads of money, or they bought it and now they're in a GT3 RS. Okay, loads of options and stuff on it, but they all have loads of options. But yeah, it was up for sale in April at 235. Now it's 199,400, and it's not gone anywhere. Oh yeah, that's, well, don't buy that one. Again, another here, Premier GT. They've knocked 20 grand off of it, and they've been sitting on it for ages. What about the regular cars, the GT3s with wings? Okay, this is going to be similar. Oh, look at this. Yep, 170 grand for a lovely looking Ruby Star car. Was 188,900. Again, at Porsche Centre Perth. So this is, you know, 18 grand they've knocked off the car. Here's another one here, 14 grand knocked off the car. You get the idea. 20 grand knocked off this since September. I think this is enough examples, right? You can see there's a clear pattern here. Cars are up for sale. They're getting discounted massively. They're not selling. Across the board, anything spicy, 10 to 20 grand has been taken off just in the course of this year. And these are cars that are still for sale. They may be discounted further. It's a result for me of a combination of cost of living crisis and massively more expensive finance. People just can't afford to buy these cars as cheaply as they could. Because of this, and the fact there are also now a lot more to choose from, and just simply a lot more on the market, they're no longer appreciating assets. And the minute this happens, you get two people who are going to start to panic. First off, your chap that maybe has stretched themselves to get into one of these cars that historically couldn't afford one. Maybe they've normally bought into a Carrera 2S or GTS, and a GT3 was always a stretch, but as long as it's held its money, they could have got away with it. Well, they're now going to be worried that actually they're going to lose a lot of money, potentially to the point, especially if they bought a Turbo S, they might be a negative equity. It might cost them £30,000 or £40,000 just to sell their car. That's not a situation anybody wants to be in. More than that, you've also got all the people that bought these explicitly to make money. And though they may be able to afford a loss here or there, as soon as they sniff the fact that these are not now a money-making asset, they're going to want to offload them. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. All these cars on low mileage, so all these GT3s, I mean, look at this, 902 GT3, if we put maximum mileage is 500 miles, there's still 5 cars. Look at that, and many of them discounted. That cycle that happened at the beginning, with everything going up, well, the opposite is now true. People don't want to buy these cars. They're too expensive for a lot of people to get into, even with the massive discounts, 20, 30 grand off, because finance is up so much. That same car 2-3 years ago at the higher price might have been more affordable because that's the way the monthlies would have worked out. Now, though, people are struggling to sell these. When there's 170 Turbo S to choose from, what are you going to do? Simple fact is, if you got one of these cars and you don't love it, and if you love it, that's fine, great, enjoy it, love your car. But if you bought it with the hope of making money, now is the time to get off this train. Is this going to affect the older stuff? Air-cooled cars, 356s, 993s, that sort of thing? I don't think so much. There'll be a few really peaky examples, but mostly they're considerably rarer cars. The market knows where they sit, and the people that have those, I don't think are going to be quite so panicked about moving them on. Many of these are going to be owned on short-term, 2, 3, 4-year PCP deals, where at the end, they have to find something to do with that car. And right about now, if I had one, I'd be getting nervous. In any case, I hope today's video has at least made a little bit of sense and that you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.